Hello, this is Christian Idealism. Today we have a very special guest. We have Inspiring Philosophy from YouTube. This guy, whatever people call him, Inspiring Philosophy, he is probably my favorite YouTube apologist, and he is also the one that inspired me to start this channel in the first place. So I kind of asked him a few months ago if he wanted to do an interview, and he said it's good. So welcome, Inspiring Philosophy. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so obviously in the when we messaged each other, I gave you the questions I was going to ask you. So we're going to start off with the New Testament, and the question that I get or people want to ask you is, so people use Josephus to support the view that Paul believed in some sort of two-body view of the resurrection. It is alleged that he says to the Pharisees in the Jewish war, and that they believe the souls of good men are to be removed into other bodies in heaven. So how would you respond to that objection that Paul was referring to instead of a two body resurrection rather than just a physical resurrection?
Yeah, you don't actually hear that a lot on the internet. You hear that more in scholarship. I've read books where they spend hundreds of pages delving into Paul, trying to understand what's going on. A little less with Josephus, though. One of the things you note about Josephus, there's a lot of scholars have noted this from N.T. Wright, E.P. Sanders, is that one thing about Josephus, though, okay, even if Josephus does believe this, that doesn't mean Paul agrees with him. We should take what Paul says on his own words, not on what Josephus says. But even at that, I mean, the scholars I've read have argued that Josephus is not rejecting the resurrection for the same reason Paul wouldn't be. One thing we know Josephus is doing is his audience is the Greeks and the Romans, and he's trying to explain Jewish concepts to them in terms they would understand. This is something E.P. Sanders notes in his book, Judaism, Practice, and Belief. Somewhere around page 300 or 301, 302, somewhere around there, if I can't remember correctly. But he's arguing that Josephus is trying to explain these concepts almost in like Platonic language, but that doesn't mean he necessarily agrees with it. N.T. Wright also talks about this in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. I believe in the second chapter, around page 175. Um, he notes that, for example, Josephus's language, although it may appear to be that way, doesn't necessarily mean that. And one of the things, if you look at one of the quotes from Josephus, is that he, I mean, if you look at both of them, the ones that skeptics often bring up, Josephus is still saying you get a body. He's not saying that you get a immaterial ether existence like Socrates would have said. He says you're getting a body, and that's kind of similar to what Paul says, where Paul's talking about it's sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. Some people think he's talking about some sort of like spiritual immaterial existence, but if you look at the actual words Paul uses, he's saying more or less enlightened and unenlightened. So we're kind of our bodies are currently unenlightened. We die ignorant. We're raised. We're more enlightened. We're more holy. And that's all Josephus is kind of saying. We get a new body in the sense that it's new, that it's pure, it's holy, it's no longer filled with sin or corruptness. It's not saying that you get like a different type of existence. He's still using the word body there, and he's still using the same word for resurrection.
Right. Okay. So he's not trying to argue. Josephus is referring to something else. Just because Josephus says it doesn't mean that Paul would have
Well, I mean, I
agreed
would
with
argue
this.
that Josephus is kind of in agreement with Paul, not necessarily on Jesus, but on what the resurrection means, that you come back with a new body. Now,
Okay.
that doesn't mean it's an immaterial, ether-like body. It'd be a physical body, but that's kind of what you see when you read Josephus, and I would refer people to E.P. Sanders on that and T. Wright as well.
Okay. Thanks for answering that. All right. So now the next question I have is, what do you think about the first five books of the New Testament? Do you think that this was historical, or in that do you think that we should accept the traditional view, which is the Mosaic authorship, and do you think that viewpoint is probable in the most rational viewpoint, or do you think that there's other
You, you mean Old
viewpoints on
Testament,
that?
right? Because you said New
Yeah.
Testament.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Old Testament.
I mean, we need to look and see if it's historical. We just can't assume it or assume it's not. I mean, that seems what you get from a lot of people. Is they sort of either they're on the far right and they would say yeah, it's completely, totally historical, or you get people on the far left that just fables or fabrications. I mean, we need to look at what the exegesis of the text reveals. We just can't assume that. One thing we do know is it definitely is written in a lot of ways like historical documents. I don't think the authors are necessarily trying to write fiction. It seems they're definitely trying to write historical documents from that regard. Now, if they're 100% true or not, we need to study the evidence and evaluate it is. Based on what I have studied, I tend to favor that they are historically reliable in what they're telling us and whatnot. And there is specific evidence for that. But the first 5 books, of course, cover a lot of different things. I mean, we're talking about stories from Abraham, the flood, the Exodus, moving into getting ready to conquer Judea and the land of Canaan. So there's a lot of things that cover. And I don't know if you can really say flat out, yes, it's all historical or not. I mean, we'd have to look at each individual story and look for the evidence for it. I mean, obviously, we're not necessarily going to find archaeological evidence of Abraham. He would just been like a shepherd, living like 1800 BC to 2000 BC, somewhere in there. So, I mean, we need to actually look at specific evidence for it. I mean, I would argue that from what I've seen regarding evidence for Exodus around 1446 BC, regarding how that fits in with Egyptian chronology, I would say that we do have good reasons to think it's true. One thing I would remind people is to employ the principle of charity on this. And so what I mean by that is when we read Livy or Cato about Hannibal invading Italy and causing all these problems, moving elephants across the Alps, one could argue that's pretty extraordinary. You don't just do that every day, especially in the ancient world. A lot of times we have to take what a lot of these ancient authors say, basically on what they tell us. We can't go back and study the ancient battles. We can't be there ourselves. So we have to look at what the ancients say, and we basically go over that. That's how it works with Roman historians. Same with someone like Alexander the Great. We don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for his battles, or we don't have any. We just have these stories given to us by Plutarch, Arrian, and a few others. So that's basically what we have to go on in a lot of cases. It seems like with the Bible, we don't employ the principle of charity sometimes. We tend to employ, hardline skepticism right away. It's fiction unless we can find absolute archaeological proof of it. I don't think that's how that works. It's sort of special pleading, putting the Bible up on a higher standard than you would judge other ancient documents. And the argument from apologists like myself is let's judge it like we would any other ancient document. Let's not assume it's fiction unless we have good reason to think that.
Right. And then would you agree that this is kind of a follow-up question, but would you agree that Moses was the one to write the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or just?
I don't actually think that. And the reason is because that's sort of imposing a Western view onto the text. We tend to think, for example, Paul sat in a room and wrote all his letters and sent them out. Well, that's not accurate. We have to remember ancient Koine Greek was written in all caps with no spaces. The reason why this was done was because books were meant to be read out loud in groups. There was no silent reading, really. So sometimes letters were kind of written in group settings. And if you read a lot of the openings of Paul's letters, you get that. Like the openings of Galatians tells us that there were other brothers with Paul when he was writing this. Oh, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians give us 2 other authors. Same with a lot of other books. They kind of do that. And so when you read the Old Testament, I would argue that's sort of a very similar culture in that it's very collectivist. I would argue that Moses was probably one of the authors, but he would also have been writing with the priests, with Aaron, with other elders. It would have been a collective effort to put these things together. And just to say that one guy sat on a mountain and wrote all this, that's a real Western way to interpret the text. What we would understand from collectivist cultures is that they were kind of written in group settings. They were kind of put together from the groups themselves.
Okay.
I think that's where a lot of skeptics get this confusion. They tend to think there was all these individual ancient authors that put it together.
Okay, last question regarding regarding this part of the Old Testament. So, would you think that Noah's flood, we should say, took place? Like, obviously you think it's local. So, where do you think this flood would have taken place at?
I think we have enough geological evidence to assume that if it did happen, it happened when the Persian Gulf flooded in. It also flooded a lot of the Tigris, Euphrates River Valley, a lot of that area up in there. So it would probably have happened there, probably 9,500 BC, 10,000 BC, somewhere around there. I have to look exactly at when this melt happened, when a lot of the glaciers melted and it filled in a lot of the lands. It affected a lot of the Southeastern Asian area as well. I would suspect that's probably when it would have happened. Noah would have been someone living in that area, built an ark. But I mean, I would also argue that the ark was not built as you would see it in Kentucky. They used a base 60 measurement system, so that'd make the ark much smaller, and that's kind of complicated to explain, but I'm probably going to do a video on that down the road.
Okay. Okay, now we're going into the resurrection. So I know you're an idealist. I am as well. This whole channel is dedicated to idealism. So some people have been asking, how do you explain the physical nature of the resurrection under idealism? Because under idealism, there is no physical substance. So how would you explain the physical nature of that?
Well, I mean, we still acknowledge there is a physical universe here, even though we disagree about the ontology of it. No one's going to say that I'm not standing in a room right now. I don't have a body. We would just argue that there is more monism in that.
Right.
It's a different substance.
But some people, yeah.
So Jesus
Sorry.
obviously would just simply project, it'd be projecting his body back. It would not necessarily be like he's reassembling more substances. It's more just, it's just the ontological difference of it. I would say the resurrection kind of functions very similar with just changing terms around.
Okay. I think you answered that. All right. So now the next question has to do with Bayes' theorem. So what is your response to the people using Bayes' theorem, probability theory, to show that theism is most likely false, or people using it to show theism is most likely true?
Well, I mean, it's hard to really use that in a lot of philosophical arguments. The ones I've seen, I don't really use it because, I think the arguments can be made without it. And a lot of times, I start to roll in the back of the head when people hear it because it's really complicated. And I think the arguments can simply be made and be made more interesting without it. For arguments against theism, a lot of times when you see this, they're not taking in all the data. So like when people use it to try to argue against the resurrection, the argument typically is the prior probability of someone resurrecting has never happened. Therefore, it's very improbable that Jesus would resurrect. And it's like, well, that's kind of ridiculous because we.
Hey, IP, your audio is very low. So could you raise your audio?
Is that better?
Okay, that's a little bit better. Yeah, because some people were arguing that. Okay, talk now.
Yeah,
Okay, I think that's good.
Okay. Okay. So the argument basically is that. So the argument is that it's very unlikely for people to have resurrected prior to Jesus. Therefore, the probability of Jesus resurrecting is very low. But that is to ignore the actual specific data to the events surrounding Jesus. We could do the same with Hannibal. It's very unlikely Hannibal could cross the Alps with elephants because no one's done it prior to him. Therefore, it probably didn't happen. No historian would use that type of logic. We would look at the historical documents concerning the actual existence of Hannibal and his life. We would not say, well, no one's crossed the Alps with elephants on a regular basis, therefore it's unlikely Hannibal would have. No, we need to look at the evidence specific to that. And so, I mean, a lot of these arguments, they tend to, both sides do it, theists and atheists, they tend to ignore the evidence they don't want to include in Bayes' theorem. And so it gets complicated, it gets kind of messy, and that's why I don't really encourage it, I don't really use it myself. I think the arguments can be made without it.
Okay, so now we're going to go back into the here. Can you mute your mic because I'm kind of echoing from your side.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so what do you think about this? Some people, I call it this new materialism, where they redefine materialism to dodge evidence. For example, they'll say that quantum field theory allows for an ontological material universe where the quantum field possesses an objective dimension, which is represented by a wave length amplitude, by asserting that this new materialism says, okay, the quantum field is fundamental like a 3D waterbed on the size of the universe, and the particles discretely pop in and out of existence, writing energy peak/interaction in this quantum field that's ontologically physical. What do you think about that?
It's kind of like if you want to redefine materialism to include things that would function that would not necessarily be, well, we would understand material in that aspect, then you're just kind of like, you're broadening the scope to include just about anything. I mean, I remember I was responding to No More on my blog one time, and he was kind of doing the same thing. I mean, if you're just going to redefine materialism away, then you're just going to make everybody happy. I mean, I don't really care what you call it. I care about the evidence. And if the evidence infers an idealistic picture of reality, fine. If you want to redefine materialism to include how we've defined idealism, then by all means, go ahead. It's not going to really change the evidence.
Right. And then because they'll argue that that there's this dimension, this objective dimension. So then there's still material object. It's just like in this weird kind of redefining terms way. And so,
Yeah, it doesn't really change anything. Just redefining terms isn't an argument. That's just, if you're going to redefine your terms so that everyone agrees, then fine, we agree. We can move on and talk about other things then.
okay. Okay, now this next question is kind of, this is, you see this a lot, like Potholder54 did a recent video. He kind of used this objection. So what is your response to the God of the gaps objection made by atheists? Like they'll say, oh, well, we don't have a scientific explanation, therefore it can't be God, you know, that type of thing.
Yeah, for that was pretty bad. He's usually much better than that. His recent video made a lot of erroneous errors. The God of the gaps argument really seems to be sort of like the last resort for atheists. If they can't refute the argument, they just call it a God of the gaps and they move on. That's ridiculous. That's not how this works. First of all, what they're basically saying when they say this is that my theory of how the universe works can't explain it. But I know my theory is true, therefore the evidence probably does infer my theory already. So any evidence that infers God must just be a gaps filler until we can sort out all the issues to infer what I want to be true. So they're basically admitting there's holes in their own theory they can't explain. And instead of realizing the evidence infers theism, they're just going to assume the evidence doesn't infer theism and hope in the future someone smarter than them comes along and fixes it for them. That's basically assuming your conclusion. A true God of the gaps argument is looking at a physical process and putting God in there. So it's like, I don't know how lightning happens, therefore God just does it with magic. Okay, that's not what the arguments from natural theology do. We look at all the data, what we know of the natural world, and then we infer it to an outside cause or an outside explanation of it. That's not trying to fill in a hole within a natural process. That is trying to look at the whole process and infer the most likely explanation of it. To try to just turn everything into a God of the gaps is ridiculous. That's basically assuming your conclusion, and any evidence that would infer theism must automatically be a gaps argument because you already decided God can't exist. Therefore, any evidence that infers God is just a gaps argument. It's just arguing in a circle.
Okay. All right, I want to move on. So now we're going to go back to the Old Testament. So there's a lot of things in the Old Testament. Like I've seen atheists complain that there's slavery, there's genocide, there's like a lot of bad things. And so how would you address the atrocities done in the Old Testament? And what would you recommend as answers to those objections?
Well, this is similar to something I was telling David Smalley on dogma debates. So we were talking about a different subject, but I would say the same thing basically. You don't understand the ancient Near Eastern context. This is what we get a lot of time. First of all, the modern version of slavery is outlawed right there in Exodus 21:16. You can't kidnap somebody and force them to work for you. So right then and there, we see that the entire Atlantic slave trade was immoral according to biblical standards, because that's exactly what was happening. And a lot of scholars have noted the word slave had a much bigger, uh, much bigger meaning than it does in the modern term of it all. So this is, of course, misunderstanding the ancient context. Most scholars will note, who've studied this, will note it's more in line talking about indentured servitude in the Old Testament, the Torah specifically. People who willingly put themselves into like a contract with somebody else, where they would work for them, and then they would be provided shelter and food. Because back then there wasn't like our modern culture where you just get an apartment anywhere you wanted and just get a paycheck. Back then, people just went directly for what they needed: food, shelter, water. So they'd work for somebody on their property, and they'd get provided these things. And then, of course, if you read further in Exodus 21, it talks about punishments. If you hurt a slave, you have to let them go. If you kill them, you could be in huge trouble. All these certain things are coming up in that. And a lot of scholars have noted this is like in the culture about that time, like we compare it to like the Code of Hammurabi. It's unbelievably altruistic and compared to a lot of things. So it's part of like progressing humanity further in a lot of ways. Regarding the genocide issue, there's never one time God commanded genocide in the Old Testament. No time did God ever say, go kill those people for their skin color, or go kill those people for the race they are or who they are. That's never happened. We're told numerous times that God is bringing judgment upon people for their sins. And this idea that God commanded genocide, it's also kind of a misunderstanding of the ancient context. For example, in a common example cited is 1 Samuel 15, where God tells Saul to go kill all the Amalekites, every man, woman, and child. It sounds horrible. The only problem is if you read 1 Samuel 30, you see David is still fighting the Amalekites. Well, if Saul was told to eliminate them, wipe them out, every man, woman, and child, what are they still doing there? I thought they were all wiped out. And this is ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. It's sort of like when we watch a football game or a basketball game and we say the other team annihilated them. We don't necessarily mean they literally killed the other people. We mean they just won a typical game. We see it in other cultures as well. Like, for example, Ramses says that he utterly destroyed the Hittites. There was none left. But based on our archaeological evidence and reading all sorts of texts, we basically conclude that, it was almost a tie. The Egyptians kind of won. It's like, but of course, it's blown way out of proportion. So that's kind of one of the things we get with regarding this, is we get this sort of read. And a lot of times we'll note that in a lot of the ancient Near Eastern works, when there was a battle fought, women and children were sort of included in the massacre. But most of the time, that wasn't what happened. They were simply sort of taken back to and used as servants, or they were incorporated into the actual culture itself. I have a quote here. I can't seem to find it right now, but it's one of these scholars, and he's basically saying that in the ancient Near Eastern context, you would see this a lot of times where it would seem like the children and the women are being destroyed, but they're really not. They're just being cared, being used in, or just being used in the actual way to hype up the battle.
Okay, thanks for answering that. So now we're gonna go kind of into the problem. I think this kind of goes into the problem of evil as well. So obviously the problem of evil has been written on extensively in the literature. I'm pretty sure people like William Lane Craig, a lot of apologists have written tons of books on it. But to someone that's dealing with that problem on an emotional level, how do you respond to the emotional problem of evil?
Well, just going back real quick to the other question, I found the quote. I have it written down here.
Okay.
It's from Daily Life in Ancient Mesopotamia, pages 236 to 237. And she says, one of the most valuable spoils of battle was the people. In the Sumeria period, tablets record long lists of women and children. Sometimes women and children were included as part of the general massacre, but usually they became servants or slaves. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Moving on to the next question, regarding the problem of evil. I mean, you're not going to give any. You said the word emotional, which is important because you're never really going to comfort somebody with words who's really going through something that really is terrible. You're just not going to have them. The one thing you have to remember is that the problem of evil is more of a logical issue in regards to philosophy. And of course, there's all answers to that. If you're going to have to comfort someone going through that, I mean, I would highly recommend you just comfort them. You don't try to make it better with words, because words aren't going to make such things better. You just have to help them through it little by little. You pray with them, you comfort them, you get them through it, but you don't try to give them an argument as to why their suffering is happening. That's not a good idea.
Okay. Thanks for answering that. Okay, so now we're going to go. I know you did a few videos on evolution and more specifically process structuralism, and you did a very good job of explaining both the science and the theology behind your viewpoint. But one thing that I don't think you addressed really is how do you explain things like original sin and the fall of mankind under your viewpoint?
What I tend to do here is I tend to throw it back in a lot of the young earth creationists' face to try this. One thing they'll note is they will argue that Cain married his sister. But if you read the Levitical law, that's specifically outlawed. You do not marry your sister or your brother. Yet young earth creationists believe because Adam and Eve were the only two people, Cain had to marry his sister. Well, why? Well, their argument is that law wasn't given yet. Okay, well, that's how the same idea will function under theistic evolution. The law wasn't given to humans yet until a certain time. Man did not enter into a specific covenant with God yet where he had to follow the moral laws. So that's basically the argument, is that the covenant wasn't necessarily given yet. So you couldn't necessarily covenantally sin against God until God said, if you're going to write a covenant with me, I need you to do these specific things, and then
Yeah.
I'll do these specific things. So that argument I don't think necessarily works by the young creationist's own standard.
Now, I used to be a young Earth creationist. Typically, the response that you get from that is that it says that Eve was the quote unquote mother of all the living, and then they'll use that as evidence that she had to be the first living human to be created. So, how would you respond to that under a
Okay, well,
theistic evolution?
yeah, follow me. Okay, so yeah, this should be obvious that no one is going to take this literal. You know, Eve is not the mother of all the pigs or the dogs or the cats. They would say Eve is the mother of all the living of humans. So no one is going to take that at that. And another thing you have to remember is that in Genesis 4, the same phrase comes up, not with mother, but with father. It says that, it talks about sons of Cain, Jabal and Jabal. I'm probably mispronouncing this, but it says that one of them was the father of all those who play the harp and the lyre, and the other one was the father of all those who have livestock and dwell in tent. Okay, it says either the father of all. Now we know that's not true because Abel had livestock, and Jabal was not his father. There were probably other children of Seth who kept livestock because that was typical of that culture back then. And I don't think they're the only people who played music. That would be kind of ridiculous. So obviously, that we understand that those phrases don't mean they are literally the father of everyone who does those things. There are people today who are not descendants of those people. So John Walton addresses this in his books, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. This is just an ancient Near Eastern phrase to refer that this is somebody considered of great value within that specific area. So Jabal and Jabal were considered, patriarchal people within that frame of what they're given. They would have been someone you go to for guidance, for leadership regarding a specific profession. Eve would be considered the same thing with regards to all the living. She's not literally the mother of all living things walking on Earth. That would be ridiculous. And not even young Earth creationists make that claim. So they constantly want the phrase to be literal, but sort of literal. It's clearly literal because the Bible says it. It's got to be completely literal, but it can't be completely literal because Eve is obviously not the mother of all the cats and dogs. So they want to have their cake and eat it too. The phrase just expresses, as it does in Genesis 4 with these two sons of Cain, you're sort of like a patriarch or a matriarchal figure within that certain framework they've given you.
Okay, so just kind of a follow-up question. So you would, when it says that, I know even young Earth creationists would agree with you that it doesn't literally mean Eve was the mother of all the living of the humans. Now, again, they still use that to argue that she had to be the first human and that she gave birth to all the rest of the humans, through generations and stuff. So that's kind of, would you give the same response to that as well?
If that phrase means Eve literally has to be the mother of all people, then Jabal and Jabu literally have to be the fathers of everyone who has that specific profession. So that's ridiculous. No one's going to assume that as well. So obviously, since the phrase is used in that regard, you cannot interpret it to be literally the mother of all humans. She's simply a matriarchal figure that all the living look to for guidance. It's not so much. I mean, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want to take it literally, then you have to believe that Jabal and Jabal are literally the fathers of everyone who has those specific professions, and that's just nonsense.
Okay, thanks for. Again, I think process structuralism is kind of really supported scientifically, and it's very compatible with scripture. So I think you did an excellent job of. Okay, now the next question I want to, and I haven't. This was like a question that I'd been wanting to ask you for a while. I just haven't. I just thought of it like the other day. So this is like, I guess let's just say apologists have not really addressed this. So the question is, how would you respond to the scientific studies done on prayer that have shown that prayer is not an effective tool for healing someone physically or psychologically?
Well, for the same reason you can't do a scientific study on what Donald Trump is going to tweet tomorrow. he's a conscious agent and he's got his own free will. He can do what he wants. God does. There's nothing in the Bible that says God has to answer your prayers. I don't understand why people would waste their time studying this thing. No person has ever claimed prayer works 100% of the time. The Bible doesn't claim that. I don't even know of any other religion that claims that. That's ridiculous. What do they think? Prayer is not like a natural process that every time you plug in a prayer, you get an effect out of it. You're asking a conscious agent to do something for you, and that agent can either incorporate it into his will or not. That's just the way it is. You just can't, you can't try to use prayer as a way to debunk God in that regards, because no one said prayer was 100% effective. Prayer is mainly for communion with God, putting your trust in him, putting your worries in him, letting him make these decisions. It's not necessarily for you to get what you want.
Okay, and because I've seen people like, for example, Anti-Citizen X. He has a video called "Prayer Debunked" where he points out a bunch of verses that say that Jesus says that if you ask, you shall receive, and therefore the scientific studies done on prayer, since they show that prayer is not effective, then therefore the Christian God cannot exist because of that. Would you agree? Would you respond? How would you respond to that?
I mean, this is yet again misreading scripture with Western eyes. I mean, to respond to Anti-Citizen X, there's a video by Tecton TV called Professor Mitch, Pray and Let's Pray. Weird title, but it's, P-R-A-Y and Let's P-R-E-Y. So, and he's responding to this basically because other atheists have made this as well. And no, that's not what he's saying. Because there's a lot of ancient Jewish ways of expressing hyperbole. Like, if you have the faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. That's an ancient Jewish idiom. We're just saying, you even have a little faith, you can do amazing things. It's sort of like if we say, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. We do that in our culture. Why couldn't other cultures do it? I mean, and so one of the things he notes in this video is, and if you look up scholars, you get the same reaction. I'm referring to the video because anyone can go watch that right now. It's only like 6.5 minutes long. But this is sort of like, you're not going to ask these things from God unless you were an extremely pious individual. You're basically expected in that culture. You're not going to ask God for certain things unless you're already aligning himself with your will. The prayers that Jesus is telling about, he's giving to people who are assumed to be following him. It's not so much this idea that you can get whatever you want just because you can just ask God for it. That's unbelievably unscholarly, and it's what I would expect from a lot of internet atheists like Anti-Citizen X. They don't actually look at the scholars. They don't actually go beyond that. And an interesting thing is the letter of 1 John mentions this as well because he's writing to Gentiles. But he also notes, you just can't get everything you want in this. This is basically you're praying for things already in line with God's will.
Okay, thanks for answering that. Okay, next. So this next question has to do with idealism, and more specifically, it has to do with the history of idealism. And typically, people, whenever I introduce idealism to people, they typically reject it not for scientific or philosophical reasons, but rather they reject it because it's not "quote unquote" supported by Scripture, and it's not supported in the Christian, by the church fathers. And so my question is, what is the Christian history behind idealism, and why should Christians be open to idealism from purely a historical standpoint?
Well, there have been Christians within the past 200 years. That's pretty much a standard. The word is not brought up, though. I think that's probably what people are worried about. But neither are words like dualism brought up in the Bible at all. Does that mean we can't be dualists? Well, no. It's in regards to what the evidence would suggest. And we do see verses that would agree with an idealist perspective. I talked a little bit about in my video, "A Universe from Nothing, Therefore God Exists," where I just mentioned there are verses that correlate to this understanding of the universe. Just the simple idea that God spoke the universe into existence. That's just, if you were going to explain information creation to ancient people, that'd be an easy way to do it, because that was information to them. They didn't have computers. They would understand it as sort of words being carried out. They're sort of dependent on the person, but they're not ontologically the same to the person. It sort of kind of reflects the idea we see in idealism. So the idea the Bible wouldn't cohere with it, I don't necessarily agree. There's a good video I did called Christianity and Panentheism, where I talk about this, and I mentioned some other verses that would correlate to this.
Okay. And then, so with regards to the, I want to discuss just a little bit more on this, and then we'll do the hangout afterwards. So when it comes to idealism, um, typically people, they'll assume that the Bible is teaching this material ontology, and therefore you would have to accept this dualism where you have the supernatural and the natural, and then the natural is the quote unquote material, and then the supernatural is the immaterial. And so, just from a historical standpoint of how people understood creation, would you agree that they thought that the creation was ontologically the same as God? From, like, because idealism, the universe is immaterial, just as God is immaterial. So from a historical standpoint, would you agree that that's what they would think? That's what they would have thought the universe was?
I don't know because they wouldn't have used those terms. They would. I mean, the idea of supernatural and natural distinction is sort of an enlightened thing. That would not have made sense to the ancient people because the gods were always at work, and for the Hebrews, the natural laws were simply the manifestation of God's will. These were not. There was no sort of supernatural. They wouldn't have understood things like divine intervention because they'd have been like, God's always acting. I mean, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. What we would call the laws of physics, they would call it like the laws of God or how God's will is acted out. I'm currently reading a book by John Walton, ancient Near Eastern thought in the Old Testament, and he brings up this a lot. He brings up the fact that this is sort of like a category we're imposing on the text. We need to actually look at the ancient Near Eastern context and see what they would have thought of these things. And they would not have had these sort of ontological distinctions in that regards, because to them there was no supernatural, natural. There was no material, immaterial. There was just everything was just like together as sort of one reality. And it's really kind of hard for us Westerners to try to like understand what they're talking about because we're very very far divorced from that culture. There are some similarities, but not everything is the same. Obviously, I mean they understood humor. It's like there are some similarities there, but things like this there are clearly differences. So for them, they wouldn't have had these distinctions. So like for example, they didn't have a word for brain. You never see brain come up in the Hebrew Bible. You don't see the word mind. Anytime mind comes up, it actually more translates to entrails, because that's where they thought the conscious part of themselves was, or the seat of the emotions or the feelings was their entrails. That was sort of like their categories or understandings of things. So, it sort of like translates to, you have a feeling in your guts. That's sort of what they would think of as who they were. So they didn't really see themselves as sort of like a material and an immaterial thing combined in one. They saw themselves as nefeshes, souls, as persons itself. You didn't have a nefesh, you were a nefesh. You didn't have a body, you were a body.
Okay. And then finally, so so you've done apologetics, you've done all this work. And so myself, I'm 16 years old. And so I come from the Z generation or the I generation. And what is the best way for the younger generation, which would be my generation, to learn more about Christian apologetics in general?
Well, watch my videos, honestly. That's the best way. No, just read. That's the best way to learn. That's where I learn a lot of my stuff. I read books and I go through them with a highlighter, so that if I ever need to go back to them, I can find easy references. Like I'm currently writing a script right now for a video later to 2018, and I'm going through a couple books I've read over the past year, and anything I highlighted, I read again, and I read the context around that, and I try to get a better feel for it. So just read a lot, listen to lectures, listen to podcasts, watch some videos. There's all sorts of things. If you want to learn this, it's very easy. All the information is out there and available. It's not that hard. Just there's no secret to it either. Just get out there and start learning.
Okay, thank you. I think that answers all the questions I have. So thank you for joining. We're going to now go into the hangout, the after interview, the post interview hangout. So you can join us there, and we'll have some other people in there as well. So end the broadcast now.